Hi, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of the new season of AWS Nordics Office Hours. My name is Gunnar Grosch. I am a developer advocate at AWS, and I am based in the Nordics. So this is our weekly show where I bring on AWS experts to let you, our viewers, learn about AWS and get all of your questions answered. And of course, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So ask questions, post comments, and you do all of that in the chat throughout the show. And don't worry if we don't get to your questions straight away. We'll try to answer the questions where they are relevant in the stream. So for each episode, we have a specific topic to talk about. And this week, well, it's no difference. We are going to talk about application configuration and how to safely deploy application configuration with the help of AWS AppConfig. And to do that and to educate you, our viewers, I have two guests on this time. I have Vinni, Satija. She's a product manager at the AWS AppConfig team. And I also have James Seward. He's a senior solutions architect for public sector at AWS. So welcome to the show, both of you. And Vinni, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. Hey, Gunnar. Glad to be here. This is obviously my first time here. And as Gunnar introduced, my name is Vinni Satija, and I'm a product manager for AppConfig. I've been with Amazon for a little bit more 4 years, and I'm also based out of the US, and I'm based out of the HQ2. That's near Washington, D.C. So it's a lovely morning here, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for waking up early and joining us here for the Nordics Office Hours, Vinni.
Absolutely.
And next, James. So, James, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, Gunnar. Thanks for having me. So my name's James Seward. I'm a solutions architect. I'm based here in the southwest of England. My day job is I work with public sectors in the healthcare vertical, but I'm also an AppConfig specialist, and that's why I'm here to do some of the technical stuff today.
Cool. Throughout the show, we're going to look at a lot of different examples, see how we can use AWS AppConfig for deploying application configuration. But let's start from the beginning. What is configuration when it comes to applications? What are some examples of how we're seeing customers using configuration?
Right. Yep. So application configuration enables customers to change application behavior at runtime. So a common example that I love to give customers, or whoever I'm talking to, is that imagine as an application owner, you're trying to release a new feature. When your code is deployed, you want to unhide that feature. And you want to do that along with a marketing announcement. Or as a DevOps engineer, you're trying to deal with an operational event where things are tense and you want to release that fix as soon as possible. And there's no time to do code deployments, but you want to either change the logging verbosity of your application or collect logs on a more granular level, or the changes that need to be deployed fix, and we can't wait for code deployments. That's really the changes that we would like to deploy as application configuration. So things that are fast, it's dynamic, and is consumed by your application at runtime. It sort of, kind of is the basics of, what AppConfig is sort of built on. And we're trying to provide some more safety controls and validation, and a lot of, changes that can be consumed by their application, by customers' application at runtime is really kind of, it revolves around.
And the option, well, if you're not separating your application configuration, that would mean to instead embed it into your code, right?
Right. So I'll just quickly go back and talk about the legacy ways of what are the other ways that if customers are not, let's say, using something like AppConfig, which we'll dive a little bit deep into. There are two common ways that we've seen customers use application configuration. One, they would either embed that into the code. And this has been like the most common way of storing configuration. It's been very legacy. And obviously, saving application configuration as code provides you the safety control that I was just talking about within the code deployments. However, it's super time consuming. So the example that I just gave, as an operations engineer or a DevOps engineer, if you're trying to deploy a fix to your application, we obviously can't wait for a code deployment or in a feature release use case wherein the feature is already deployed, but you're trying to unhide the feature for all of your consumers, and it's a global application. If you're doing that as a part of a code deployment, it would probably take days, for it to flow through your pipelines and have that feature be available to the customers. So in cases like that, it's probably not a very good idea of storing that configuration into the code. And that's one of the common things that we've seen across our customers, that's the normal way of doing things. It's been like that for a long time. So while this has been time consuming, but it comes with a lot of safety controls, another way that we've seen when the customers want these changes to be fast, or they want these changes to be consumed by the applications quickly, we've seen that they store these application configuration values in databases. So what that makes is all you do is you change that one entry in your database and you're ready to go when that application configuration value changes. So what happens in that case is, while this is really fast, obviously that change reflects immediately. It can be consumed immediately by your application, but there are obviously some concerns with that approach as well. So number one, it's fast. So that means your application is able to fetch that immediately, but imagine that value either, let's say, had a typo or that was not correct, it wasn't the expected value that your application expected. What could happen? So we're looking at risks of outages, and it happens, we're all humans. We could make typos or any other errors in configuring those values. And, that's obviously, there's more risk, than anything else there for your application. Secondly, obviously there's, since values get deployed fast, there is also not a way to roll it back. Unless you make that change again. First you catch it, you make that change again, and then your application is able to consume it again. So obviously the lack of rollback mechanisms, there's so many outages, there's so many risks of outages, and then obviously imagine if that database is unavailable, right? So in that case, there isn't really that store to fetch that value from, and again, that kind of poses a risk to the application, as an outage. And I've been talking to several customers, and whenever I talk to them about these problems, there's always been a data point that I get that we always have application configuration and misconfigurations are their number one reason of why their applications go down. So we know that this problem is widespread. We know that customers face it pretty much applications across all of their domains, and there's definitely we needed to build something to kind of, just kind of innovate and how we can, provide customers a new way of making sure that there's less risks of outages to their applications.
And that's where AWS AppConfig comes in then.
Absolutely.
As a way to solving that. And well, tell us a bit about AWS AppConfig, the different parts that it actually solves in that, the problem that we're trying to solve with AppConfig.
Right. So I just talked about a couple of problems that we've heard from customers. These are pretty much have been the ways of deploying configuration in general. So with AppConfig, there's actually a little story behind how we released AppConfig. It's been a service since 2019, but maybe a few of our customers know that this has been a service that's been used at Amazon by more than 4,000 teams, and it's been in use for almost half a decade. So Werner Vogels, who's our CTO, he's the CTO of Amazon. He recently also posted a blog, and that I really like that blog because he talked about how these configuration best practices were at Amazon. In the early days, when to make any little change to our website, we had to kind of redeploy the whole website. That thing was a gigabyte, in size, and redeploying that would, obviously take hours. Our engineers would be on call. So that wasn't obviously the best way of, doing things, but that's exactly where technology was at that point in time. And, Amazon was no different. But at the pace that we're releasing software now, configuration or application configuration here plays a very important role. So I would love to share that blog with our customers and as Werner talks about, the various issues that Amazon faced as well, and we wanted to move fast. We wanted to ship features fast. We wanted to, deal with operations event quickly. We knew that there needed to be a system where we could store and fetch these configuration values from that central system. So we had an internal service that our team started to use as a best practice. It was definitely, we were doing great, and our customers, obviously, we were the ability to ship software. The velocity really increased, and that's how we sort of thought that we should share the same best practices around application configuration with our customers, and that's how really AppConfig was released. So just to kind of dive a little bit deep into what we were looking for when we were building our own internal configuration management system, we wanted the ability to store and update configuration data quickly, and obviously it should be separate from code deployments. Second, we wanted the ability to have applications fetch that configuration value from a service, and we shouldn't be falling into the same issues with like databases, for example. We wanted it to be highly available. And then obviously third, the ability to check and validate those configurations prior to the deployment, so that we want to make sure that whatever value we're deploying, what is expected by our application, it does not have any errors. It makes sense, just because we wanted to make sure that it's really sensitive, right? It can affect your application. It has risks of outages. So we wanted to make sure that those values are correct, and those checks are done prior to deployment. And as soon as we deploy them, it's valid, and we don't have any risks of outages. And also we wanted to make sure that there's a rollback mechanism that's available. And those best practices are sort of baked into AppConfig, and we'll, James would probably like to talk a little bit more in detail and give customers an overview of the service.
Yeah, that's great, Win. Interesting to hear about how it actually evolved from something internal at Amazon into something that customers at AWS can use today. And if you just joined us, this is the AWS Nordics Office Hours, and I'm joined by Vinni and James today to talk about AWS AppConfig and application configuration. And James, I think you're eager to get started showing off AppConfig. So I don't think we need to wait anymore. Let's dive into that and have a look at the things that Vinni actually talked about, how that looks in practice. So, and hey, everyone in the chat, nice that you're saying hi. And we have a question that I think we'll save for a bit, because I think James will get there pretty quickly as well.
Yes.
So, James, I'm adding your screen share, and let's start out.
Okay, thanks. So by way of demo, I've used all of my technical ability to create this Hello World example application. So this is just a little Python Flask application running on a couple of EC2 instances with a load balancer. And it really just renders a Hello World page. And what I've done is I've hooked up to AppConfig to receive the configuration value for the background color of the page. So hopefully that's a nice, obvious demo that I can show. How AppConfig is rolling its configuration out. So if I look in AppConfig itself, this is the AppConfig sort of homepage. It's part of AWS Systems Manager. You can see that I start by having these two applications defined. So I've got a Lambda application for a future demo, and I've got this EC2 application. So the applications, the configuration starts by being divided into the application that needs it. And then if I click through into there, you can see that under my application, I have this concept of environments. So at the moment, I just have this one demo environment, but the environments are really there to allow you to deploy configuration to different groups of, in this case, instances, so that you can roll out, I think like the question was asking, can you push configuration out to a QA environment and a prod environment, that kind of thing. And so environments is the way that you would do that. You would have a QA environment and a pre-prod and a prod, whatever matches the way that your environments are deployed.
And the question here was for serverless applications, but it doesn't really matter if it's for EC2 based application in this case, or a serverless
Correct.
application.
Right.
Yeah.
Just to kind of add on there, like AppConfig is very agnostic to the targets. So again, we define targets as either it could be your EC2 instances or your serverless Lambda functions, on-prem servers, IoT devices. It's pretty much agnostic to what is at the receiving end. So just to kind of iterate that, yes, for serverless itself.
And basically the same configuration could be used for both as well.
Absolutely, yeah. You could store that application configuration centrally, and it could be received by any set of targets. And you could have separate environments for those.
Yeah. Yeah, so in this case, I've divided my demo applications because they're doing different things into these two different applications in AppConfig. But there's no reason why you couldn't sort of mix and match if you wanted, or create, an environment that represents your EC2 instances and an environment that represents your Lambda functions. And I think, something Vinny said is there is very important. It's that you can deploy the configuration that you've created. You can, it becomes this redeployable thing that you can send to different environments. And so that means that you can send that configuration to your QA or your test environment, and you can validate it. And then when you roll it out to your prod environment, you know that you're deploying exactly the same configuration that you've already tested to the production environment. So that sort of, again, prevents any typos as you go between environments.
And these are practices that I think a lot of people are familiar with when it comes to the code we deploy, using the CI/CD practices that is very familiar to most developers. But in this case, for application configuration instead.
Right, and just to kind of add on to what Gunnar said, again, I'll point back to the blog that our CTO wrote recently. He kind of talked about continuous configuration. So that's sort of, CI/CD, CC. That's what, we've been trying to tell our customers, because essentially CI/CD helps you with your code deployments and, automate it across and make your software delivery faster. However, these configuration changes sort of need to happen like in parallel to the CI/CD pipelines. And it would, for any changes that are deployed at runtime, continuous configuration is sort of the way to go. So give that blog post a read. Definitely really interesting.
Yeah, and I posted the link in the chat earlier.
Cool.
All right, James.
Yep. So the final piece that we haven't really seen here is the actual configuration itself. And so in AppConfig, those live inside what are called configuration profiles. And you can think of these as being sort of a set of related configuration settings. Is the easiest way to get started thinking about those. So inside my application profile, I have a hosted configuration. This means that it's the AppConfig service is storing this configuration for me. AppConfig supports quite a few different backends to hold the configuration, but in this case, I'm using the built-in one. And you can see that my configuration document is really just a JSON document that's defining the background color as white for my application. So this is sort of the moving parts for AppConfig that you need set up. So if I just jump over to my application code, I can show how that's then loaded by the application, because I think this sort of helps close the loop for sort of how the environments and profiles and application values that we've seen work. So this is the application code that's running on my EC2 instance. Like I said, it's a fairly straightforward Flask application, just giving me really the ability to render this little HTML template. You can see here that I'm pulling in the background color using sort of templating. And then what I'm actually doing in the application is I'm supplying the value for that variable to go into the template by reading it from AppConfig. So if I just back up a little bit here, I've got this AppConfig helper library. So this is a little Python library that wraps up the API calls that you need to make to AppConfig in order to receive your configuration. Part of the reason that I'm using this is it sort of helps enforce best practices. So there's a few values that you need to supply to the API when you're calling it in order to get the best value out of it, really. And so this helper library is doing that for me.
Is it time to do a shout out to the developer of that library, Vinny?
Well, it's developed by James, and I'm just super stoked about it. Lots and lots of our customers are using this library. It's on GitHub. I'll definitely post the link to that. But yeah, thanks, James, so much for doing that. Lots of
Thank you.
Is this dog fooding?
In a sense, yes. I mean, so the library itself came out of an internal project that I was working on, and I realized I should wrap up the functionality and make it a library. So that's where it originally came from. But the helper library, you can see it's taking these 3 values that I'm actually reading from the environment, and they are supplied into the environment by the CDK stack that's deploying this whole demo. So that's sort of how it all gets tied together. But those 3 values are the AppConfig application name, the environment name, and the profile name. And then the 15 is the number of seconds it should cache that configuration. So it's not repeatedly fetching the configuration and hammering the AppConfig API. It will sort of cache it for 15 seconds and then see if it needs refreshing. And then when the page is loaded, that's done by this function here. So the first thing I do is check to update the config. So this won't update the config if it's been less than 15 seconds since the last time it did it. If it has been, then it will automatically fetch the config for me. And then I'm checking a variable. We'll ignore this use new template value for now. So what I'm doing is rendering that template that we saw at the top of the file. And into that background color, I'm just providing the background color variable that I've read from my JSON configuration. And then the application returns the rendered HTML, and that's what renders on the page. So that's really sort of the bits you need to get started with using AppConfig in your application.
All right, so let's get back to AppConfig then, and I think have a look at how to actually make a change and how to do that using AppConfig and a deployment of a new configuration.
Yeah, so for the purposes of the demo, I'm just going to do this in the console. I don't have a continuous configuration pipeline set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new version of my hosted configuration. So it's these are versions so that you can actually sort of perform rollbacks, or you can go back to a previous version of the configuration if you encounter problems. So what I'm going to do is I will change the background color from white to a sort of gray color, and then I will just save that. So now I have version 2 of my hosted configuration, but this isn't live yet. This is just created in the service. What I actually need to do is run a deployment process to roll this out to the environment.
And comparing this to the other ways that you talked about earlier, Vinni, for instance, storing in a database or storing in, I don't know, S3 or something like that, Absolutely. It would basically mean that you would be live with this new configuration then.
Absolutely. Yep. So this is, again, one thing that's super great about AppConfig is you can manage multiple versions. So you can store unlimited versions here. And just to kind of go back a little bit, you could still store your configurations in S3, or there are certain other configuration stores that we support within AppConfig as well. So if you're a customer of Systems Manager parameters and you're storing your application configurations as string values, you could definitely reference those here, and you could deploy it with the same safety mechanisms that we talked about using AppConfig. Similarly, we support a Systems Manager document store. We also support S3. So essentially, that version control that James just sort of talked about is available for all of those configuration stores. We also do have an integration with AWS Code Pipeline, and AWS AppConfig is integrated as a deploy action there. So that gives customers some other sources that potentially they could use to store their application configuration centrally and deploy them through AWS AppConfig. Also, just to make sure that folks know that, again, AppConfig is very agnostic to the type of data that you're deploying. So pretty much text, JSON, YAML, that's supported by AppConfig. So it's pretty much agnostic to the type of data that you're deploying.
So I do have an environment I've been working on where what I'm storing in AppConfig is actually a MIME multi-part document. So I've stored multiple things together in one configuration. So yeah, you can store a lot of stuff in there. So to perform my deployment, I'm going to deploy this to my demo environment. I'm going to use version 2 of the configuration that I've just created. And I'm also being prompted for a deployment strategy. I think we're going to come back to that in a little bit for a future discussion. So for now, I'm just going to leave that and hit start deployment. And it's now actually started rolling out my configuration to my environment. So you can see that it's going to give me a progress bar as it rolls it out. I've got some details about what's going on. I've got a CloudWatch alarm. We're going to look at that again in a minute. But if I go to my application and start refreshing, at some point, we will start seeing the background color change. So this is one of the sort of key things that's important here, is that this change is being rolled out slowly, well, not too slowly for the purposes of the demo, but it's being rolled out across my application fleet. So there's a few EC2 instances that are running behind this load balancer. So while one of the instances might have already received the updated configuration, at this moment, that hasn't been the instance that served my request. But now we've refreshed and we've now hit an instance that has seen the new configuration. I've got my background color update as rolled out. So looks like that's progressed pretty well. And if I go back to AppConfig, we can see that we've actually hit 100% complete on the deployment. And it's now in this baking phase, which is where AppConfig waits to make sure that everything is okay with your deployment before it declares that it's finished. But that's rolled out now.
Just to kind of add on here, what James sort of talked about was the AppConfig deployment strategy. So again, going back to the database example, that approach also does not have a way in which you could roll that change to your instances like one by one, or roll it gradually. And obviously, there are instances where you need that change to be available to all of your services, all of your servers all at once. But AppConfig sort of provides you the best of both worlds. Like, you could do it either ways. You could also deploy that change immediately. That's obviously not recommended as a best practice, but deploying it gradually so that if there are any errors, you could catch them early on. And if that configuration change needs to be rolled back, it could be done early on. Again, everything just kind of ties back into mitigating the risks of outages for your applications, and which is why this feature is super amazing. Wherein if it's a test environment and you're just deploying it to a small set of targets, you're just testing out something. You could probably deploy it quickly across those instances or across those targets. But when it's a production change, the recommendation there would be to kind of progress slowly. So you could either progress by like availability zones, or depending on however you're managing your targets, it would only deploy that application configuration change to a small set of targets, wait to see if there are any errors, and then sort of move on until the deployment is 100% complete. So again, that kind of gives you that best practice wherein a lot of safety that's sort of built into our code deployments, kind of exists here with AppConfig as well. And again, just going back, it's been an Amazon best practice, and that's how that's been a recommended strategy for customers to roll out configuration.
Yeah, and that shows why we use the word safety, or safely deploying our application configuration.
Absolutely.
So there's a question in the chat. I think this might be for you, Vinni. Would you recommend using AppConfig to replace feature flags using a vendor product? Yes,
absolutely. Feature flags has been one of the bigger use cases that we have seen across our customers. So they've seen wherein customers are storing their feature flags as a JSON document, and they've defined all of the flag metadata within that. So definitely that's one of the bigger use cases for storing your feature flags within AppConfig. And you could obviously use the deployment safety that's built in, the deployment strategies that we just talked about. And also you could have, I'll actually like to touch on a little bit more about the validation. So there's also a JSON schema validation that we offers. And what that validation does is it makes sure that your configuration data is kosher prior to deployment. So in this case, if let's say your feature flags are in a JSON document, you could verify that against a JSON schema to make sure that there are no errors. And if there are any syntactic errors, for example, you're missing a comma or you're missing something, or you've made a typo, those are caught early on so that when you actually deploy that configuration data, there are no errors. So that value is exactly what your application sort of expects.
Yeah, that sounds like a great segue to what you're about to show, James.
So yes, I do actually have some validators applied to this environment. So what we're looking at here, the highlighted section, is the JSON schema for the EC2 applications JSON validation that was deployed to AppConfig. So this is a a standard, the JSON schema here. And it's really describing what the JSON configuration document needs to look like in order to be valid. And the way to read it is that inside this properties sort of block here, I've declared that I want to have a property of background color. I've got a human readable description, and then I said that I need it to be a string. And also I've said down here that this property is required. And then the other interesting one here is this additional properties value means that I'm allowed to put in other properties into my JSON document, my configuration, and the schema will accept that. If you wanted to say that this was the only thing that could go into your schema, you would say additional properties are false. So I can demonstrate how this works with AppConfig. So if I go back to my environment and go back to my configuration profile rather, and I'll try creating a new version of my my configuration document where I've made some stupid typo and I'm setting the background color to 0. So that's not what I want. My validation said that that needs to be a string. So I've saved that configuration version. And now if I try and run the same deployment that I did before, but with this newer version, what's going to happen is I'm going to get an exception thrown by the API to tell me that it's a little it's a little technical, I guess, the error message. But effectively, what it's saying is that, or in this case, it's actually my Lambda handler. I've out validated myself. Let me make another change to this. So yeah, the other piece to this puzzle perhaps is that let me do that, and then what I'm going to do is let me see if I can make an error by using the UK spelling for color. Let me see if that one will get caught by my validator. There we go. So this one is telling me, no, this is also my Lambda validator. So I've actually put too strong a validation on this. That's a little unfortunate for talking about the JSON schema. But I can neatly segue here to, I guess, the fact that I've got a Lambda function that's performing additional validation on my configuration. So this is the contents of that Lambda function. And what happens is whenever I start a deployment, AppConfig is going to call this Lambda function with the configuration of the that I'm trying to deploy. And so my Lambda function, this line here is just fetching the value of the configuration out of the event that is passed into Lambda. And then what I'm checking is, has the value that I've been passed as the background color property, does it match this sort of HTML color code format? So I'm looking for it to be a hexadecimal code of either 3 or 6 characters. And if it's not any of those, then I raise an error so that the validation is failed. So, this is, like I said, this accidentally out-validated my JSON schema test, but you can see here that this is my Lambda function saying that it was unable to, in this case, parse the 0 as the string type that I wanted. And if I change the configuration profile to have an invalid format, so I put the wrong number of characters in it, for example, then it will also detect that and prevent that from going out to the application. So what's happened here is before my application receives this invalid configuration data, I'm prevented from rolling it out into the environment.
So can we say that the schema validation is for more syntax validation, simpler type of validation of the configuration, and the Lambda function validation can be more complex validation? Could basically check more or less anything with that Lambda function.
That's right, yeah. The JSON schema validation really makes sure that, in the case of JSON at least, that your configuration is the right shape. So it's got the right properties, the properties have the right types. You haven't got any extra properties if you're not allowing that, for example. But the Lambda function is where you can apply whatever logic is necessary to say, while the configuration value for background color is a string, is it a string with the right format? Is it a number in the right range? That kind of thing.
Surely Dev says in the comments that the error is that you spelled color without the U.
Yeah, so the error then is that my validator code is looking for background color without the U, and it throws a key error on the dictionary that it's received. But yes, unfortunately, HTML color or CSS properties don't have the U in. So as a bit of behind the scenes, I had all kinds of fun putting this demo together where I was absentmindedly spelling color with a U in some places and not in others. It took me a while to straighten all of that out.
Yeah.
All right, Vinny, did you want to add something to the validation?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we also don't limit customers to probably just attach that either or. So you can make sure that your configurations are syntactically correct with that JSON schema that we were, talking about. And also you could attach multiple validators. So you could have a Lambda validator or multiple Lambda validators for your configuration, just to make sure that pretty much it checks against all of the logic that you want it to check against.
Yeah. In this case, I think I've got the validators in the wrong order. Look, so it's running the Lambda function first.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
All right. So if you just joined us, this is the AWS Nordics Office Hours with me, Gunnar Grosch, and today I'm joined by James and Vinni to talk about application configuration with AWS AppConfig. And James is now showing off his amazing EC2 application where he has made a configuration change and deployed it. So now we have a gray background color. And we've also looked at validators to validate the configuration. So next then, we talked about safely deploying, and we've talked about, shortly at least, about the deployment configuration and how to actually do profiles for deployment. Should we look a bit more into that, perhaps?
Absolutely.
You talked a bit about it, how to safely deploy by doing it in different ways. Can you just show us an example of how that looks in the console, James?
With the monitoring, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that we sort of glossed over when I showed it earlier was this sort of baking phase of the configuration deployment. And what's happening there is while AppConfig is rolling the configuration out across the fleet, and for a configurable period after it's finished rolling out to everything, it waits and it monitors a CloudWatch alarm to see if your application is performing correctly. And so the way this would work is you create a CloudWatch alarm to say monitor latency for your application, or one to say, how many errors is it returning out of all the requests, that kind of thing. And if your application starts misbehaving after this new configuration has been rolled out, your CloudWatch alarm goes into the alarm state. AppConfig will detect that, and it will start rolling back, or say it starts, it pretty much immediately rolls back the configuration across everything back to the previous version, the version you were using before you started the rollout. If I go into this demo environment, you can see that I have this CloudWatch alarm configured against this particular environment. And if I just pop over to the CloudWatch console, that's this alarm here. So you can see at the moment, everything is okay. For the purposes of the demo, I'm not actually monitoring any CloudWatch metrics for this alarm. I just have the alarms sort of exists, and I'm going to manually set the status to show what it can do if something goes wrong. So let me start by deploying the version of the configuration that makes the background of the page white. So that makes it nice and easy for us to tell what's going on. And I'm going to roll it out using this linear 50% every 30 seconds deployment strategy again. So I'm going to click.
The product kind of supports 3 predefined deployment strategies that we've created for different use cases, but you could always go and create your custom deployment strategies. And let's maybe dive deep a little bit into that, creating your own, James, after this.
Yeah, it's definitely worth mentioning that deployment strategy does have sort of test dev tagged against it. Deploying half of your fleet every 30 seconds is not really a best practice in order to give your application time to detect the problems, or the problems to surface, I should say. So I'm just waiting while the configuration rolls out. So you can see that we're now starting to see the background color of the page go white. And what I'm going to do is pop over to my command prompt, and I have a little script that's going to set the status of that CloudWatch alarm into the alarm state. So this is just to simulate, having an alarm that might monitor some problem with my application. So AppConfig is deploying and baking, and what it's going to be doing is monitoring that CloudWatch alarm, which should now be showing as being in the alarm status. Here we go with the little red status here. And you can see that it's immediately stopped the deployment and rolled it back due to detecting that that alarm went off. And so what it will have done is put my configuration back to the original version, which was the one that was loading the page with the gray background. And so if I reload the page, you can see that that's definitely what my application has gone back to. So AppConfig detected the alarm going into that state and immediately rolled my config back to where I was before.
And this can be used with any type of CloudWatch alarm. So yeah. You were just using an example, but it could be, for instance, a canary watching a specific URL, or it could be, any type of metric that you have alarms against, just to monitor to make sure that the application is still behaving as you want it to be.
Yeah.
Right.
So should we just have a look at the deployment strategies and how to create your own?
Yeah, let me quickly create deployment strategy. So I can just put a simple name in there. So there's two deployment types. There's linear and exponential. So this controls how quickly AppConfig sort of accelerates the deployment, if at all, while it's going through the fleet. You can then choose what percentage of the fleet will start, or what additional percentage will start receiving the new configuration during each step. And then you specify the total deployment time. So between them, the step percentage and the total deployment time will give you the value for how long it will spend on each step. Here it would spend a couple of minutes each. And then the bake time, this is the time that it will wait after it's rolled out to all of the fleet. It will then wait an additional 10 minutes monitoring that alarm before it declares that the configuration is successfully rolled out completely.
So Vinni, are there any best practices to think of if you're creating your own deployment strategies? Or
Yes.
Is that totally dependent on the application or the architecture of your application, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So it really depends on the use case that we're talking about. The recommendation obviously is to roll it out gradually rather than having that change be consumed by the application immediately. So in a case wherein again you're deploying, you're allow listing a user, for example, and if you're using AppConfig for that, that you could probably have a bake time of about a couple of minutes. In that case, we know that configuration values validate against a schema or a Lambda function. We know if that value is correct. We could probably have a shorter bake time as compared to when you're rolling out a new feature for your entire application. In that case, we would obviously recommend that we have a larger bake time and we sort of space that deployment out, across like a few minutes. So we do have an AWS recommended deployment strategy that we've added in here. It's the fourth one. So wherein actually, sorry, just a minute. If you go back, it's basically the one that progresses slowly and has a higher number of bake time. So I think it's the fourth one. So with a growth factor of 10%, it rolls out within that 20 minutes, and then kind of waits for that 10 minutes for it to bake and monitor for any alarms.
Right, and to get this to actually work as intended, you of course need to make sure that you have alarms in place that are actually monitoring the application.
Correct.
Right. Did you want to add something, James?
I was just going to say that you can, of course, manually cancel the deployment if you happen to notice a problem before your alarms fire. You can also jump in and cancel that.
Yep. Manually, you could always manually roll back that configuration if you see anything else that went wrong.
Yeah, and of course, because you have the versioned configuration stored by AppConfig, even if the deployment is completed, you can start a new deployment that takes you back to your previous version of the configuration anyway.
Absolutely.
And on rollback, it always goes back to the version that was deployed earlier.
Right, to the last available version.
Yep. All right. So James, is it time to look at the Lambda example?
Yeah. So let me quickly show.
So the first demo was based on EC2 instances behind the load balancer, but of course, as Vinni mentioned, it is agnostic basically to what your environment looks like, but there are some differences in how you're using AppConfig based on AWS Lambda compared to EC2.
Yes. So this is a simple Lambda function that really all it does is it's hooked up to API Gateway, and when it receives the request via API Gateway, it returns the text you can see down here at the bottom. It says, "Hello, demo user, you have visited," and then just gives you the URL that you visited. What I'm doing is I've got two feature flags that can transform the URL that you visited into uppercase, or can reverse it, or of course both if both are set to true. And those are coming from my AppConfig configuration. But the difference here in how I'm receiving that configuration is I'm using a Lambda layer provided by AppConfig that actually handles fetching the configuration from the AppConfig service for me. So whereas on EC2, I was using that helper library that I'd written before, in Lambda, I can actually take advantage of this, this layer that's running the AppConfig logic for me. And the way that I reach the configuration data inside my Lambda environment is I can just make an HTTP request to localhost on a particular port, which by default is 2772. And then the URL that you request on that localhost server is made up of again, the application ID, the environment ID, and the profile ID that you have deployed in AppConfig. And then it gives you the JSON configuration back that AppConfig has provided, and it's handling all of that caching logic for me instead. I don't have to have written that in this case. And then I just read the values out of the configuration and use them to transform the text. So if I pop back over to my terminal, I can make a curl request to that API gateway, and I can just put the string hello on the end. And at the moment, you can see that it's configured to just convert the text into uppercase. But the same as I did for EC2, if I go to AppConfig and then to my Lambda application instead, we can see that in here I've got the Lambda application profile. So this is separate to the EC2 application profile. And here I've got my two feature flags. So if I just set, if I create a new version and set it to enable the reversing of the string. So now I have a new version of my configuration again. And once again, I can do a deployment to this. So this is out to my environment, my demo environment. I'm using the same sort of fairly rapid deployment strategy for the purposes of the demo. And you can see that from AppConfig, there's no difference between deploying to Lambda and deploying to EC2. It's just the combination of application environment and so on that I'm picking that tells or that matches up with what the application itself is checking. So if I come out here and start visiting my demo URL again, as it rolls out, I will eventually start receiving that that text reversed as well. So this is where the caching that's being done inside the Lambda function for me is slowing down my demo. It should be there in a second.
Yeah. This is live demos for you people. This is the way it works.
This is trying to strike the balance between giving yourself enough time in the deployment to show things like triggering the CloudWatch alarms and making them prompt enough to show that they're working. I swear this worked much quicker when I was testing it myself.
Did the deployment, did it finish?
It did. And I should probably check that I do have a validator on this one, but what it doesn't validate, what it doesn't validate for me is that the intent was correct. I don't think we've got a way to validate that I meant what I put. Oh, no, I did turn it on. Oh, there we go. It just took a little while for the cache to expire. So we can see that having turned on that feature flag, it's just reversing the string. Now, obviously, that's not a super useful demo, but this is really just to show that, I was able to flip on that feature fairly quickly using the configuration flag that I rolled out with AppConfig.
And as you mentioned, you used the Lambda extension for AWS AppConfig, which is something that was Vinni, that was released at the same time as Lambda extensions became public, right?
It was actually before that. So Lambda extensions first released in preview, and that's when AppConfig Lambda extension sort of released. For folks who do not know what the AppConfig Lambda extension is, it is essentially it's essentially like a client that runs in parallel to a Lambda invocation. So that makes things a lot more easier with for serverless applications because it kind of takes care of the polling, the time interval, and the caching for you. And James would probably show the implementation a little bit.
Yeah, so I should have shown really that's not a built-in thing in Lambda. I had to add that extension in by configuring this layer. So you get the layer name and version is in the documentation. It varies slightly per region. But once you attach that to your Lambda function, the other thing you need to do is supply these AppConfig app name, environment name, profile name values so that it knows which one of your applications and so on it should be querying. But you can see it is as straightforward as just requesting that particular URL off localhost. Obviously, I'm picking up from my application environment the values I need. Those are populated for me by the CloudFormation deployment. But all I've done is use the requests library to fetch that. And you don't even need to use requests. You can use something like URLlib if you want, but requests just makes it so much easier.
Right. So we are close to top of the hour. So time to get your last questions in if you have any around AWS AppConfig and application configuration. But Vinni, I think, is there something, I think we want to talk a bit about integrations with AWS AppConfig. Tell us a bit about what kind of integrations are there.
So yeah, definitely. The first one, we sort of just touched on the Lambda extension. So, where it kind of came from was a lot of our customers obviously have serverless applications, and they wanted to kind of simplify how they fetch their configurations from AppConfig. So AppConfig Lambda extension sort of solves that for our customers. But essentially, we also have an integration with AWS Code Pipeline. So for customers that are probably using Code Pipeline for the orchestration of their code deployments, we have a similar integration with Code Pipeline, wherein AppConfig is a deploy action within Code Pipeline. So what that solves for is essentially you want to automate deployments or configuration deployments across your environments. So that's where you could model different stages within AWS Code Pipeline. You could still store your configuration in one of the sources that are supported by AWS Code Pipeline. So that includes Bitbucket, GitHub, or even S3. Essentially, you fetch it, you model your stages, and then use AppConfig deployment strategies, for example, to deploy with the same best practices that we were kind of talking about earlier, and enable rollback in case one of the deployments fail. What it also gives you is essentially a way wherein, let's say, deployments are the application configuration deployments are super critical, right? And you want to have like a manual review process that's added between the stages that, hey, if stage 1 is complete, I want somebody to review it, and then it moves over to the next stage. So Code Pipeline sort of enables you to do that as well. And then what it also enables you is to maintain those separate pipelines than your code. so that, again, going back to the continuous configuration that, we're talking about, all configuration changes could be deployed across your environments from code pipeline using the orchestration and the automation that's available there. So essentially, we're trying to be well integrated within the developer workflow, and kind of so that customers can use this the same way that they deploy code.
Yeah, and besides that, you said it early on, James, that you were going to use the console for the demo purposes. But what are other ways that customers are using AppConfig today? You mentioned that your setup was with CDK as well, James, I think.
Yeah, so that demo environment was built out with CDK. You can use that to create new versions of your configuration and then trigger deployments as well, if you sort of want the integration there. I think part of what we've talked about today, though, is having your application configuration deployment separate from your application deployment itself. And so you can probably a good way to do it would be to use CDK to build the deployment pipeline for your application configuration as well. But then have that run using code pipeline and the AppConfig integration there. I think that's a good way to do it.
And besides that, you can update your configuration using CLI or console or CloudFormation or any way you actually want to.
Yeah, like everything else, it's all API driven, so that you can integrate with you can either do it directly on the CLI, or you could start building your own tools if you've got some sort of internal deployment process that you wanted to integrate AppConfig with. You can take advantage of the APIs and the SDKs to integrate that.
And one more question, Vinni. We saw the examples that James gave now that contained one property for the EC2 ones, and we had two properties, I think, for the other one. But how big of configurations are people using it for?
So the limit that we offer to our customers is about 1 megabyte. There's also, when we talk about what is the size of your configuration, we always say that it obviously shouldn't be huge, because at that point it's not configuration anymore, probably. So configuration values generally, like, we see our customers constrained within that 1 megabyte value that we provide, and so far it's we haven't received any customer feedback that that's not enough. So generally those values are sort of constrained within that 1 megabyte.
There's features in AppConfig you can use to break it down into more meaningful chunks of configuration as well. So those configuration environments and profiles, you can have a deployment of a profile that might be an allow list for a bunch of accounts. So it's a big long list of account numbers, and then you might have another configuration profile that's your feature flags, for example. That makes it easier to reason about what it is you're deploying, and it also makes it easier to sort of troubleshoot and investigate and diagnose, because you haven't got this nearly 1 megabyte of JSON that you're trying to work with.
Correct.
Yeah, one megabyte of JSON is quite a lot of configuration to have. All right, so any last best practices, anything you want to share, Vinni or James, before we wrap it up?
I mean, I would just sort of, revise like the configuration workflow or the AppConfig workflow. Like, you configure your application configurations, always make sure they're validated, and then make sure that, those configurations that are validated obviously are deployed gradually. And that's, what they've always recommended, and make sure that there's a rollback mechanism. So deploy your configurations the same way as you manage your code, and with the same operation scrutiny.
Yeah, I definitely call out having comprehensive monitoring of your application, because if you're going to make your configuration deployment sort of take advantage of all the automated features that we've talked about today, you need to be able to safely monitor your application, or correctly monitor your application, so that if anything goes wrong with that deployment, AppConfig is able to help you out by automatically rolling it back. But that means you need to have good alarm coverage or good metric coverage, so you can diagnose that.
Right, great points. So I just want to say as well that I think that AWS AppConfig is one of the hidden gems of AWS. Not enough people are using or know about AWS AppConfig so far. So I think everyone has application configuration and the use case for it. So as we normally end these shows, just try it out. All right. And with that, I want to thank James and Vinni for joining me today. I want to thank everyone for watching, and thanks for the questions and comments throughout the show. And next week, we're back with another episode, of course, on Monday, where we're going to talk about simplifying serverless best practices with AWS Lambda Power Tools. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.